Jake Martinez walked through the massive corridors of the Kepler-7 research station, his footsteps echoing in the vast space designed for beings much larger than himself. The station orbited a dying red star, its metal walls stretching high above, his head like a cathedral built for giants. Every surface, every doorway, every piece of equipment had been designed with the average galactic citizen in mind. And Jake was far from average. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, Jake was considered tiny by galactic standards. The corridors that felt spacious to him were actually cramped quarters for most other species. The Vorthic warriors who served as security guards had to duck their massive 9-foot frames through doorways that Jake could walk through without even thinking about it. Their thick armored hide made scraping sounds against the metal walls as they moved, and their heavy footsteps shook the floor beneath Jake's feet. The Zilani scholars were different but equally imposing. These crystalline beings stood 7 feet tall, their bodies made of living crystal that refracted light into beautiful patterns. When they spoke, their voices created musical chimes that the universal translator converted into words, but Jake could still hear the underlying melody. They moved with precise, calculated steps, their crystalline limbs catching and throwing light in ways that made Jake feel like he was walking among living diamonds. Then there were the nebulans, floating, clouds of sentient gas that took up even more space than the others. They communicated through chemical changes in their composition, creating swirling patterns of color that the station's sensors translated into speech. Jake had learned to recognize when they were amused because their colors would shift to lighter shades, and he saw those colors far too often when they looked at him. Jake worked as a xenobiologist in the station's research division. His small laboratory was tucked away in a corner of the science wing, surrounded by much larger labs belonging to researchers from other species. His credentials were impressive by human standards. He had graduated top of his class from Earth University with a doctorate in xenobiology and had published several papers on cross-species adaptation that had been well received in human academic circles. But here, surrounded by beings who had been studying alien life for thousands of years, his achievements felt small and insignificant. The other researchers tolerated him, but Jake could sense their amusement. When he walked into the communal research area, conversations would pause for a moment. The Vorthak would look down at him with what Jake had learned to recognize as their version of a smile, showing rows of sharp teeth that could tear through metal. They would pat his head with their massive hands, careful not to crush his skull, and make comments about how cute the little human was. The Zilani were more subtle in their condescension. They would chime in harmonious patterns that the translator rendered as polite compliments, but Jake could hear the underlying amusement in their crystal voices. They would ask him questions about his research with the same tone one might use when asking a child about their finger painting, interested, but not really expecting anything profound. Commander Thex was the worst of them all. The draconian military leader stood 8 feet tall with scales that could deflect plasma fire and claws that could rend steel like paper. His reptilian eyes were cold and calculating, and he made no effort to hide his disdain for Jake's presence on the station. During briefings, he would openly question why such a fragile little creature had been assigned to such an important research facility. He would suggest that Jake would be better suited to desk work on some safe human colony world, far from the dangers of real scientific exploration. Jake's only real friend on the station was Dr. Luna Patterson, a fellow human who worked in the same research division. Luna was nearly 6 feet tall, which made her much more acceptable to the other species, though still small by their standards. She had arrived at the station 2 years before Jake and had managed to earn some respect through her work on alien plant biology. Luna tried to defend Jake when she could, but even she sometimes seemed embarrassed by the way other species dismissed him. The daily routine was always the same. Jake would arrive at his lab early, hoping to avoid the crowds in the corridors. He would spend hours analyzing samples and data, working on research projects that he hoped would prove his worth to the galactic scientific community, but whenever he tried to present his findings or contribute to discussions, he was met with polite but dismissive responses. The other researchers would nod and smile, but Jake could see in their eyes that they didn't really believe a human. So small could have anything meaningful to contribute. The worst part was the way they talked about humans in general. Jake would overhear conversations in the common areas, where other species would discuss the little Earth creatures and their strange customs. They found it amusing that humans were so emotional and attached to each other, so different from the logical. Zilani or the honor-bound Vorthak. They would wonder aloud how such small, weak beings had managed to develop space travel at all. Jake tried to ignore the comments and focus on his work, but it wore on him. Every day brought new reminders of how different he was, how small and insignificant he seemed in this vast station filled with beings who had been exploring the galaxy for millennia. He began to question whether he belonged here at all, whether he should request a transfer back to human space, where he could work among his own kind without constant reminders of his limitations. But Jake was stubborn, a trait that seemed to be common among humans. He refused to give up, even when the other researchers made it clear that they saw him as little more than a curiosity. He continued his research, hoping that someday he would make a discovery important enough to change their minds. He dreamed of the day when the other species would see him as an equal, when his size wouldn't matter because his mind and his contributions would speak for themselves. That opportunity came sooner than he expected, in the form of the most dangerous assignment the station had to offer. When the call went out for a volunteer to study the behavioral patterns of a captured shadow maw, every other researcher on the station found excuses to avoid the assignment. The creature was considered too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to kill anyone who got close to it. But Jake saw something different in that assignment. He saw a chance to prove that size didn't matter, that courage and intelligence could overcome physical limitations. He saw his opportunity to show the galaxy what humans were really made of. The containment level of Kepler-7 was a place most researchers avoided unless absolutely necessary. Deep in the lower sections of the station, behind multiple security barriers and reinforced blast doors, lay the most dangerous specimens the galactic community had ever encountered. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very atmosphere knew it contained something that should not exist. Jake stood before the massive containment unit that housed Subject 47, though he had already begun thinking of the creature as Rex in his private notes. The containment cell was a marvel of engineering, built with materials that could withstand the force of a small nuclear explosion. Triple-layered transparent aluminum barriers separated the viewing area from the creature inside, and energy fields hummed constantly, ready to deploy additional defenses if needed. Rex was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, even in the extensive databases of galactic fauna. The creature stood 12 feet tall when fully upright, his body covered in fur so black it seemed to absorb light itself. His limbs were proportioned like those of a great cat, but built on a scale that dwarfed even the largest Earth predators. Each paw was equipped with retractable claws longer than Jake's forearm, and his head was a perfect fusion of feline grace and predatory intelligence. What struck Jake most were Rex's eyes. They were large and intelligent, with pupils that could dilate to capture even the faintest light. Along his body, bioluminescent markings created patterns that shifted and changed, currently glowing a dull red that the station's computer systems interpreted as anger or distress. But Jake saw something else in those markings, something that reminded him of the complex light patterns used by Earth's deep-sea creatures to communicate. The creature had been captured during what the military called a pacification mission. On Ragnarok 3, a death world where the sun never shone and evolution had taken a decidedly lethal turn. The planet's official designation was listed as cleared of hostile life forms, but Jake's research into the mission reports revealed troubling inconsistencies. The military had encountered what they described as organized resistance from creatures that were supposedly non-sentient, and the Shadow Maw had been the only survivor of what appeared to have been a complex civilization. 3 researchers had already died attempting to study Rex. The first had been a Vorthic warrior scientist named Krell, whose armored hide and combat training should have made him nearly invulnerable. The station's security footage showed Rex moving with impossible speed, his claws finding the one weak point in Krell's natural armor. The death had been swift but brutal, and the other researchers had concluded that Rex was simply too dangerous. To study up close, the second victim had been Dr. Zara, a Zilani scholar whose crystalline structure could withstand incredible pressure and temperature extremes. She had attempted to use her species' natural ability to interface with silicon-based systems to somehow communicate with Rex through the station's computer network. Her shattered remains had been found scattered across the containment area. Her crystal structure fractured in ways that suggested Rex had somehow understood exactly how to break her apart. The third researcher had been the most disturbing case. Dr. Nix, a Nebulan scientist, had tried to use chemical communications to reach Rex. Nebulans were essentially living gas clouds with no solid form for Rex to physically harm. But somehow, Rex had found a way to disrupt Nix's molecular cohesion, causing the scientist to literally dissolve into component gases. The station's atmospheric processors had been overwhelmed by the sudden chemical release, and it had taken hours to restore normal air quality to the containment level. After the third death, Commander Vex had declared the creature too dangerous for further study and had recommended immediate termination, but the Galactic Scientific Council had overruled him, citing the rarity of apex predators from death worlds and the potential military applications of understanding such creatures. They had issued a call for volunteers to attempt behavioral analysis, with the understanding that the volunteer would likely not survive the assignment. Jake had been the only one to step forward, much to the horror of Dr. Luna Patterson and the amusement of the other researchers. The betting pools that had immediately sprung up among the station's population gave him less than a 10% chance of surviving his first day in the containment area. Commander Vex had been particularly vocal in his predictions, suggesting that Jake would be dead within minutes of entering Rex's domain, but Jake saw something the others had missed. While reviewing the security footage of the previous incidents, he had noticed patterns in Rex's behavior that suggested intelligence rather than simple predatory instinct. The creature had waited for each researcher to make specific moves before attacking, almost as if he was testing them. His bioluminescent markings had changed in consistent patterns before each attack, and Jake suspected those patterns might be attempts at communication rather than simple emotional displays. More importantly, Jake had noticed that Rex never consumed his victims. Pure predators would eat their kills, but Rex had simply eliminated threats and then retreated to the far corner of his containment area. His behavior suggested defensive rather than aggressive motivations, and Jake began to wonder if the creature was reacting to perceived threats rather than hunting for food. The station's computer systems monitored Rex constantly, tracking his vital signs, movement patterns, and bioluminescent displays. Jake spent weeks studying this data, learning Rex's routines and trying to understand what might be going through the creature's mind. Rex slept very little, spending most of his time pacing along the far wall of his containment area. His bioluminescent markings cycled through the same patterns repeatedly, almost like a mantra or a prayer. Jake also noticed that Rex showed signs of what humans would recognize as depression. The creature's movements had become sluggish over the months of captivity, and his bioluminescent displays were growing dimmer. He rarely responded to external stimuli, and the station's medical scanners showed elevated stress hormones in his system. Whatever Rex was, Jake realized, captivity was slowly killing him. The breakthrough came when Jake noticed that Rex's bioluminescent patterns changed whenever Jake approached the containment area. The creature would move to the transparent barriers and watch Jake with what seemed like curiosity rather than hostility. His markings would shift to blue and green patterns that lasted only as long as Jake remained in view. When other researchers approached, Rex would retreat to the far corner and his markings would return to the angry red patterns that had become his default state. Jake began to suspect that Rex could distinguish between different species, possibly even between different individuals. The creature's responses to Jake were consistently different from his responses to others, suggesting a level of awareness that went far beyond simple animal instinct. If Rex was truly intelligent, then his previous attacks might have been attempts to communicate rather than random acts of violence. Armed with this theory and against all station protocols, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He requested permission to enter Rex's containment area, not as a researcher studying a specimen, but as one intelligent being trying to communicate with another. The request sent shockwaves through the station's command structure and set the stage for the most dangerous experiment in galactic history. The day Jake entered Rex's containment area, every screen on the station was tuned to the security feed. Researchers from dozens of species crowded into the observation lounges, placing final bets on how long the small human would survive. Commander Vex stood at the main viewing window with his arms crossed, a satisfied expression on his reptilian face as he watched what he expected to be Jake's final moments. Jake had prepared for this moment for weeks. He carried no weapons, no defensive equipment, nothing that could be interpreted as a threat. In his hands he held only a small piece of synthetic meat that his research had shown would approximate the taste and smell of Rex's natural prey from Ragnarok 3. The station's replicators had worked for hours to get the chemical composition exactly right, and Jake hoped this simple offering would be enough to show his peaceful intentions. The containment area's main door cycled open with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped inside. The chamber was massive, designed to hold creatures much larger than Rex, with walls that stretched up into shadows above. Rex stood at the far end of the chamber, his 12-foot frame perfectly still as he watched Jake's approach. His bioluminescent markings were cycling through patterns Jake had never seen before, rapid flashes of blue and green mixed with cautious yellow. Jake walked slowly to the center of the chamber and sat down cross-legged on the cold metal floor. He placed the synthetic meat beside him and then simply waited, his hands resting peacefully in his lap. The observers in the viewing area held their breath, expecting Rex to charge at any moment. But Rex remained motionless, his large eyes fixed on this strange small creature who had entered his domain without fear. Minutes passed in absolute silence. Jake could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the vast chamber, and he knew that Rex could probably hear it too. The creature's enhanced senses would pick up every detail of Jake's physiological state, every sign of fear or aggression. Jake forced himself to remain calm, breathing slowly and steadily while Rex studied him. Finally, Rex began to move. His massive form flowed across the chamber with the grace of a giant cat, each step deliberate and controlled. The observers pressed against the viewing windows, certain they were about to witness Jake's death. But Rex stopped just beyond arm's reach, lowering his great head to study Jake more closely. Jake could feel Rex's breath on his face, warm and surprisingly sweet-smelling. The creature's eyes were even more intelligent up close, with depths that suggested complex thoughts and emotions. Rex's bioluminescent markings had shifted to a pattern of soft blues and greens, colors that Jake had learned to associate with curiosity rather than aggression. Moving very slowly, Jake picked up the piece of synthetic meat and extended it toward Rex. The creature's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, and his markings shifted to brighter patterns. Rex extended his massive head and gently took the offering from Jake's hand, careful not to let his teeth touch human flesh. For the first time since his capture, Rex's bioluminescent patterns showed something approaching contentment. That first meeting lasted only 20 minutes, but it changed everything. Rex had not attacked, had not shown aggression, had actually seemed to enjoy Jake's company. The observers were stunned, and Commander Vex was furious. He immediately ordered Jake to exit the containment area and forbade any further direct contact with the creature, but Jake had seen something in Rex's eyes, something that convinced him the creature was not just intelligent but desperate to communicate. Over the following days, Jake spent every free moment outside Rex's containment area, studying the creature's behavior and slowly building trust. Rex would approach the transparent barriers whenever Jake arrived, his markings shifting to the blue and green patterns that Jake had learned meant peace and curiosity. Jake began to notice patterns in Rex's bioluminescent displays that were too complex to be random. The creature would create specific sequences of lights that repeated in consistent ways, almost like a language. Jake started documenting these patterns, creating a database of what he suspected were Rex's attempts at communication. The work was slow and painstaking, but Jake was convinced he was witnessing the first attempts at interspecies communication with a creature from a death world. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that Rex's light patterns changed in response to different stimuli. When Jake spoke, Rex's markings would shift to specific patterns. When Jake moved, different patterns would appear. Rex was not just randomly flashing lights, he was responding to Jake's actions with what appeared to be meaningful communication. Jake spent weeks learning Rex's light language, creating a basic dictionary of patterns and their apparent meanings. He discovered that Rex could distinguish between different emotional states, could recognize when Jake was happy, sad, or frustrated. More importantly, Rex seemed to understand that Jake was trying to communicate with him, and the creature began deliberately slowing his light patterns to make them easier for Jake to follow. The real revelation came when Jake brought a simple mathematical problem to their sessions. He would draw numbers and equations in the air, and Rex would respond with light patterns that corresponded to the correct answers. Rex understood mathematics, could solve complex problems, and was clearly intelligent enough to engage in abstract thinking. Jake realized he was not studying a dangerous animal, but communicating with a brilliant mind trapped in a powerful body. Jake's research. Reports about Rex's intelligence were initially dismissed by the galactic scientific community. His colleagues on the station found it amusing that the small human had convinced himself he was having conversations with a monster. Commander Thex openly mocked Jake's findings, calling them typical human sentimentality overriding scientific objectivity. But Jake persisted, documenting every interaction and building an ever-growing database of Rex's communication patterns. He discovered that Rex had knowledge of advanced physics and chemistry, could discuss concepts that even the station's most brilliant researchers found challenging. Rex was not just intelligent, he was educated, suggesting that his species had developed a sophisticated civilization on REGNAROK-3. The implications were staggering. If Rex was truly intelligent, then the military's pacification mission on Ragnarok 3 had not been the elimination of dangerous animals, but the destruction of an entire civilized species. Jake realized he was probably communicating with one of the last survivors of a genocide, a being whose entire world had been wiped out based on the galactic community's assumption that anything from a death world must be a mindless monster. Jake's growing friendship with Rex began to attract attention from other researchers, though most of it was negative. They saw his emotional attachment to the creature as a weakness, a sign that he was losing his scientific objectivity. Commander Thex used Jake's relationship with Rex as evidence that humans were too emotional and unstable to be trusted with important research assignments. The tension on the station began to escalate when Jake requested permission to create a modified communication device that would allow Rex to speak directly to the research staff. The request was denied, but Jake continued to advocate for Rex's rights as an intelligent being. He argued that keeping Rex in captivity was not scientific research but imprisonment, and that the creature deserved to be treated with the respect due to any sentient being. Jake's advocacy for Rex put him at odds with the station's command structure and made him enemies among the other researchers. They began to see him as a troublemaker who was disrupting the natural order of things. The small human who had once been merely amusing was now becoming a genuine threat to their comfortable assumptions about intelligence and civilization. The situation reached a breaking point when Commander Thex announced that Rex would be transferred to a military research facility for more thorough study. Jake knew this meant Rex would be subjected to painful experiments and would likely be killed in the process. He realized that his friendship with Rex had not only changed his own life but had put his friend in even greater danger. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds between species and challenge everything the galactic community believed about intelligence and worth. The observation deck of Kepler-7 was one of the most peaceful places on the station, with massive windows that looked out into the star-filled void of space. Jake often came here to think when the pressure from his research became too much, and today he needed the peace more than ever. Commander Thex had made his announcement about transferring Rex to a military facility, and Jake knew he was running out of time to prove that his friend was more than just a dangerous animal. Jake stood at the main viewing window, watching the dying red star that the station orbited. Its light was fading, and the scientists estimated it would collapse within the next 1,000 years. Jake wondered if Rex's people had watched their own sun die, or if they had been too busy fighting for survival against the military forces that had destroyed their world. The sound of heavy footsteps behind him made Jake turn around. 3 Vortex security officers were approaching, their massive forms blocking the exit from the observation deck. Jake recognized the leader as Captain Gorth, a particularly aggressive officer who had never bothered to hide his contempt for humans. Gorth's armored hide was scarred from countless battles, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a career soldier. "Well, well," Gorth said, his voice a deep rumble that the universal translator rendered with obvious menace. "Look what we have here. The little human who thinks he can talk to monsters." Jake remained calm, though his heart began to beat faster. He had learned during his time on the station that showing fear to aggressive species like the Vorthek would only make things worse. "Good evening, Captain Gorth. I was just enjoying the view." "The view," Gorth repeated, moving closer. "You know what I think, little human? I think you have been spending too much time with that beast. I think it has made you forget your place." The other 2 Vorthek officers spread out to either side, cutting off any escape routes. Jake could see other researchers and staff members watching from the corridor, but none of them moved to intervene. A confrontation between Vorthek security and a human researcher was not something anyone wanted to get involved in. "My place?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady. "I am a xenobiologist assigned to this station by the Galactic Research Council. I believe my place is exactly where I am." Gorth laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Your place, little human, is wherever we say it is. You have been causing trouble with your fairy tales about that monster being intelligent. Commander Thex is tired of your nonsense, and so are we." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that his advocacy for Rex was making enemies, but he had not realized how far some people were willing to go to silence him. "I am simply conducting scientific research. If my findings make some people uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own assumptions." "Assumptions?" Gorth stepped closer, his massive frame towering over Jake. "The only assumption here is that you humans think you are more important than you actually are. You are tiny, weak creatures who have no business in the real galaxy. The sooner you learn that, the better." Jake could smell the metallic scent of Gorth's armored hide and feel the heat radiating from the Vorthek's body. The officer was clearly working himself up to violence, and Jake knew that he was in serious danger. But he also knew that backing down now would mean abandoning Rex to whatever fate awaited him at the military facility. "I may be small," Jake said quietly, "but I am not weak. And neither are my people. We may not have armor or claws, but we have something that you seem to lack." "And what is that, little human?" Gorth asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "We have the ability to see beyond appearances. We can recognize intelligence and worth even when it comes in forms that frighten us. That is why I was able to communicate with Rex when stronger beings failed." Gorth's eyes narrowed, and Jake could see the anger building in the alien's face. "You dare to call us weak? You dare to suggest that your pathetic little mind is superior?" 2 hours before Jake could respond, Gorth's massive hand shot out and grabbed the front of Jake's shirt. The Vorthak lifted Jake off the ground effortlessly, bringing him up to eye level. Jake's feet dangled in the air, and he could feel the incredible strength in Gorth's grip. "Perhaps it is time someone taught you some manners, little human," Gorth said, his voice now a threatening whisper. "Perhaps it is time you learned what happens to creatures who forget their place in the natural order." Jake struggled to breathe as Gorth's grip tightened around his shirt. The other researchers and staff members in the corridor were backing away, unwilling to intervene in what was clearly about to become a violent confrontation. Jake realized that he was completely alone, facing 3 heavily armed Vorthak who had the full backing of the station's command structure. But Jake was not as alone as he thought. Deep in the containment levels of the station, Rex's enhanced senses were monitoring Jake's vital signs through the medical sensors that had been installed as a safety precaution. The Shadow Maw could hear Jake's elevated heart rate, could smell the fear and adrenaline in his friend's system, and could sense the danger that Jake was facing. Rex had been resting in his containment area, his bioluminescent markings dim with the depression that had become his constant companion. But as Jake's distress signals reached him, those markings began to flare with brilliant red light. The creature's massive form rose from the floor, and his eyes focused on the walls that separated him from his friend. For months, Rex had accepted his captivity because Jake had asked him to be patient. The small human had promised that he would find a way to prove Rex's intelligence to the galactic community, and Rex had trusted him. But now that trust was being tested as Rex sensed that Jake was in mortal danger. The containment area's walls were designed to hold creatures far more powerful than Rex, but they had been built with the assumption that the prisoners would be mindless beasts. The engineers had not considered what might happen if an intelligent being with Rex's physical capabilities decided that the walls were no longer acceptable barriers. Rex's claws extended to their full length, each one sharp enough to cut through battle armor. His bioluminescent markings shifted to patterns that had not been seen since the destruction of his homeworld, patterns that meant war and vengeance and the protection of family. The creature that the galactic community had dismissed as a mindless monster was about to remind them why his species had been feared throughout the galaxy. Back on the observation deck, Jake was still struggling in Gorth's grip when the first alarms began to sound. The station's emergency systems were detecting massive stress fractures in the containment area, and the security cameras were showing something that should have been impossible. Rex was tearing through reinforced walls that had been designed to withstand nuclear weapons, and he was doing it with the methodical precision of an intelligent being who understood exactly what he was doing. "What is that sound?" one of the other Vorthak officers asked, his voice uncertain. Gorth loosened his grip on Jake slightly, allowing the human to breathe. "Probably just another drill," he said, but Jake could hear the doubt in his voice. Jake smiled, despite the danger he was in. "That is not a drill," he said quietly. "That is my friend coming to visit." The sound of tearing metal echoed through the observation deck as Rex's massive form appeared in the doorway. The Shadow Maw had crossed 3 levels of the station in less than 2 minutes, leaving a trail of destroyed security barriers and disabled defense systems in his wake. His 12-foot frame filled the entrance completely, and his bioluminescent markings blazed with crimson fury that cast eerie shadows across the walls. Captain Gorth immediately dropped Jake and stepped back, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. The other 2 Vorthak officers flanked their captain, their own weapons drawn and ready. But their training had been against normal threats, not against a creature that had just proven security systems designed by the best engineers in the galaxy were merely suggestions to him. Rex's eyes locked onto Gorth's hands, still extended from where he had been gripping Jake. The creature's massive head tilted slightly, and his bioluminescent patterns shifted to deeper shades of red. When Rex spoke, his voice came through the station's communication system with perfect clarity, each word carefully chosen and delivered with unmistakable intent. "Release my brother," Rex said, his translated voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The observation deck had gone completely silent. Everyone present had heard Rex speak before through Jake's communication sessions, but this was different. This was not the curious, gentle creature who had been learning to communicate with researchers. This was an apex predator from a death world, and his protective instincts had been fully activated. Jake slowly got to his feet, his shirt torn but otherwise unharmed. He moved carefully toward Rex, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger a violent response from the Vorthak officers. Rex's massive head turned toward Jake, and his bioluminescent patterns immediately shifted to softer blue and green shades. "I am okay, Rex," Jake said quietly, placing his hand on the creature's snout in their familiar gesture of trust. "Thank you for coming." Rex's markings pulsed with warm colors as he gently nuzzled Jake's hand, but his eyes never left the Vorthek. Officers. The contrast was striking, gentleness toward his friend and barely contained violence toward those who had threatened him. The sound of running footsteps filled the corridor as Commander Thex arrived with a full security detail. 20 armed guards poured into the observation deck, their weapons trained on Rex. The draconian commander's scales were flushed with anger, and his claws were extended in a display of aggression. "Stand down, creature," Dex commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Return to your containment area immediately, or we will be forced to use lethal measures." Rex's response was to move closer to Jake, positioning his massive body between his friend and the assembled weapons. His bioluminescent patterns shifted to warning colors that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The creature's message was clear. He would not be moved while Jake remained in danger. "You cannot threaten him," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "His name is Rex, and he is my friend. He came here because he sensed I was in danger, and he will not leave until he knows I am safe." Commander Thex's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Friend? You call this monster your friend? It has just destroyed millions of credits worth of security equipment and threatened the safety of everyone on this station. This proves exactly what I have been saying about your dangerous obsession with this creature." "The only danger here came from your officers threatening me," Jake replied, gesturing toward Captain Gorth and his men. "Rex has never harmed anyone who did not attack first. He is protecting me because that is what friends do for each other." The standoff continued for long minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Rex remained motionless, his eyes tracking every movement of the armed guards while his bioluminescent patterns continued their warning display. Jake stood beside him, one hand resting on Rex's massive shoulder, both of them surrounded by weapons. But neither showing any sign of fear. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Luna Patterson pushed through the crowd of security officers, carrying a datapad loaded with information that would change everything. She had been working frantically since the containment breach began, analyzing the data that Jake had been collecting about Rex's intelligence and communication abilities. "Commander Thex," Luna said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "I need to show you something that will change how we understand this situation." Luna activated her datapad, and a holographic display appeared above the device. The display showed complex mathematical equations, scientific formulas, and detailed star charts. But these were not human creations or the work of any known galactic species. These were Rex's own contributions to galactic science, problems he had solved and knowledge he had shared during his communication sessions with Jake. "What you are looking at," Luna continued, "is the work of one of the most brilliant scientific minds we have ever encountered. Rex has solved theoretical problems that have puzzled our best researchers for decades. He has provided insights into physics and chemistry that could revolutionize our understanding of the universe." The crowd pressed closer to examine the holographic display. Zelani scholars chimed in harmonious patterns of amazement as they recognized solutions to problems their own people had been unable to solve. Vorthix scientists growled in appreciation of the elegant simplicity of Rex's mathematical proofs. "Furthermore," Luna said, her voice growing stronger, "Jake's research has uncovered evidence that Rex is not the only intelligent being we have wrongly classified. There are at least 17 other species currently listed as non-sentient monsters who show clear signs of advanced intelligence and civilization." The implications of Luna's revelation rippled through the crowd. If Rex was truly intelligent, then the military's actions on Ragnarok 3 had not been the elimination of dangerous animals but the destruction of an entire civilized species. The galactic community had committed genocide based on incorrect assumptions about intelligence and worth. Commander Thex's scales flushed with a different color now, one that Jake recognized as confusion and uncertainty. The draconian leader had built his career on the assumption that strength and size determined worth, but the evidence before him suggested that intelligence could exist in forms he had never considered. "Even if this creature is intelligent, Rex said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "It has still destroyed station property and threatened the safety of my crew." "He protected his friend," Jake replied simply. "If someone you cared about was being threatened, would you not do the same?" Rex's bioluminescent patterns shifted to softer colors as he sensed the change in the room's atmosphere. The immediate threat to Jake had passed, and the creature's protective instincts were gradually giving way to curiosity about the ongoing discussion. Over the following hours, the situation on Kepler-7 changed dramatically. Commander Rex was reassigned to a remote outpost. His career effectively ended by his inability to recognize intelligence when it challenged his preconceptions. Jake was promoted to head of the newly created Interspecies Intelligence Recognition Department. With Rex as his official research partner, the story of the small human and his protective friend spread throughout the galaxy, becoming a testament to the power of understanding and compassion. Research stations across galactic space began reviewing their classifications of so-called non-sentient species, and many beings previously dismissed as monsters were discovered to be highly intelligent civilizations. Rex was granted full citizenship rights and became an advocate for the other misunderstood species that Jake's research had identified. Together, they worked to prevent future genocides and to build bridges between species that had been enemies due to misunderstanding. Years later, when new species encountered humans for the first time, they would remember the story of Jake Martinez and Rex. They would remember that the smallest member of a species could possess the greatest wisdom, and that true civilization was measured not by strength or size, but by the ability to recognize worth in all its forms. The research station Kepler-7 became a symbol of hope for the galaxy, a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. And at its heart, a small human and a massive predator continued their friendship, proving that the strongest bonds transcend all barriers of species, size, and origin.